The infant's cry echoed through concrete walls that still smelled of gunpowder and fear. If you stayed silent in May 1946 Austria, you might survive, but this child had no such luxury. Sergeant Thomas Webb crouched in the half-collapsed bunker outside Salzburg, his flashlight beam cutting through dust thick enough to taste. The April rain had turned the rubble into a maze of mud and twisted metal, and his unit had been sweeping these hills for 3 weeks, cataloging weapons caches and Nazi documents before the Soviets claimed the sector. The sound-smell-texture trio hit him all at once, dripping water on stone, the acrid tang of old smoke, and the grit of concrete dust coating his tongue. He'd found ammunition, false papers, even a stash of stolen artwork. But never this. Never a baby. The child lay in a wooden crate lined with blankets, maybe 4 months old, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that locked onto Thomas with unsettling intensity. A folded note rested on the blankets, written in precise German script. Thomas had learned enough of the language during interrogations to make out the essentials. Mein Kind. Protect her. She is innocent of my sins. Oberst K. Richter. Colonel Richter. Thomas felt his jaw clench. He knew that name. Everyone in the 3rd Infantry Division knew it. Richter had commanded the garrison at Mauthausen concentration camp before fleeing east ahead of Allied forces. Intelligence reports suggested he'd escaped to Argentina with the help of Vatican ratlines, carrying enough looted gold to buy a new identity and a quiet life. The man had overseen the deaths of thousands, and he'd left his daughter behind like abandoned cargo. The baby's fingers wrapped around Thomas's thumb with surprising strength. He should radio this in. Let the brass figure it out. Send the child to one of the overcrowded orphanages filling up across the occupation zones. That was protocol. That was safe. But Thomas Webb had seen those orphanages. He'd delivered supplies to 3 of them, watched hollow-eyed children fight over scraps of bread, heard the night terrors that no amount of donated blankets could silence. This child, Richter's child, would disappear into that system, another statistic in a continent drowning in displaced persons. And when she was old enough to ask questions, someone would eventually tell her who her father had been. She is innocent of my sins. Maybe Richter had written those words to convince himself. Maybe he'd actually believed it. Thomas tucked the note into his jacket pocket and lifted the baby from her crate. She didn't cry, just studied his face with those 2 knowing eyes, as if she understood the weight of what he was about to do. His hands that had fired rifles, thrown grenades, pulled dying friends from burning vehicles, trembled as he adjusted the blanket around her small body. Before we go further, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there, right now. And if this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about justice, identity, and the sins we inherit. The first twist came when Thomas opened Richter's note completely. Beneath the initial message, in smaller script, was a second paragraph he'd missed. I have taken my own life rather than face what I have done. My service pistol is beside me. Tell her I was a coward. Tell her the truth. Thomas's flashlight swept the bunker's far corner. There, slumped against the wall in a Wehrmacht officer's uniform, sat the remains of Oberst Klaus Richter. The Luger pistol had fallen from his right hand, and the wall behind him told the story his note confirmed. Richter hadn't escaped. He'd stayed behind to ensure someone, anyone, would find his daughter before the elements or scavengers did. A Nazi who'd murdered thousands had killed himself, rather than face justice. But he'd made sure his child wouldn't die alone in the dark. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. Not sympathy, never that, but a recognition of the impossible arithmetic of guilt and love. This man had been a monster. This man had also been a father who'd spent his final moments writing a confession and wrapping his infant daughter in clean blankets. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question. Thomas made his decision. He knew a chaplain in Innsbruck who could forge documents, had connections with Allied administration officers who could expedite adoption papers for American servicemen wanting to help war orphans. It would cost him 3 months' pay, and probably a few favors he'd rather not owe. But Thomas Webb had killed 27 men during the war. He'd counted everyone. And he had no wife, no children, no one waiting for him back in Pennsylvania except an elderly mother who'd stopped asking when he'd settled down. Maybe this was his penance. Maybe this was grace. He couldn't undo what Richter had done. Couldn't bring back the dead or heal the wounds that would scar Europe for generations. But he could give this child a chance to be someone other than a monster's daughter. As Thomas climbed out of the bunker into the cold Austrian rain, cradling the baby inside his jacket, he made himself a promise. She would never know the truth. He would burn Richter's note, lose the paperwork, create a story about finding her abandoned by unknown refugees. She would grow up American, free from the weight of blood guilt, able to build a life on clean foundations. He kept his word about everything except one thing. Thomas Webb kept the note. He kept the Luger pistol. And 23 years later, when Sarah Webb found them locked in her father's footlocker, the careful scaffolding of lies would collapse in an instant, and she would learn that the man who raised her had been standing in that bunker when Oberst Richter pulled the trigger. But that truth was even more complicated than she could imagine. The lie took root in Pennsylvania soil, like it had always belonged there. By 1948, no one in Harrisburg questioned the story of Thomas Webb's adopted daughter. War created orphans, and good men brought them home. Sarah's earliest memories were quintessentially American. The smell of her father's Old Spice aftershave mixed with motor oil from the garage where he worked as a mechanic. The texture of worn linoleum under her bare feet in their small kitchen. The sound of Sunday morning church bells echoing down Walnut Street. Thomas had settled into civilian life with the same quiet competence he'd brought to military service, trading his sergeant's stripes for greasy coveralls and a modest paycheck that somehow always stretched far enough. His mother, Sarah called her Grandma Webb, had taken to the child immediately, never asking the questions that might complicate the simple grace of a little girl who needed love. Sarah was 7 when she first asked about her mother. They were sitting on the front porch swing on a sticky July evening in 1953, sharing a bowl of strawberries Grandma Webb had brought from the market. Thomas had been quiet all day. Sarah had learned to read his silences the way other children learn to read picture books. This one felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Daddy," she'd said, strawberry juice staining her fingers. "Jenny Morrison says everybody has a mommy. Where's mine?" Thomas had set down his coffee cup carefully, taking his time. "Your mama died when you were very small," he'd finally answered. "In the war. There were lots of people who didn't make it, sweetheart. But she loved you very much before she left." It was the first lie Sarah could remember catching him in, not because she knew the truth, but because something in his voice didn't match his words. Even at 7, she understood that adults sometimes said things they needed to believe rather than things that were actually true. She didn't push. Thomas Webb was a good father, patient, present, The kind of man who showed up to every school play and learned to braid hair from a library book. If he carried shadows, well, didn't all the war veterans in their neighborhood? Mrs. Chen's husband still woke screaming some nights. Mr. O'Brien at the corner store wouldn't talk about Normandy even when other vets tried to trade stories. You learned not to ask. The years unfolded in the reliable rhythm of small-town America. Sarah excelled in school, particularly in languages. German came to her with surprising ease, though Thomas grew quiet whenever she practiced vocabulary words at dinner. She played clarinet in the high school band, worked summers at the public library, dreamed of college even though money was tight. Thomas never remarried, never even dated that Sarah knew of, content to pour all his paternal energy into raising a daughter who looked nothing like him but somehow shared his steady temperament and careful hands. By 1969, Sarah was 23 and teaching elementary school in Harrisburg, living in a small apartment downtown, but visiting Thomas most Sundays for pot roast and practical conversation. The war in Vietnam played on television screens everywhere, and sometimes Sarah would catch her father staring at the footage with an expression she couldn't decode. Not quite grief, not quite anger, something more complicated that lived in the space between. "You ever regret it?" she'd asked one Sunday in October, helping him wash dishes. "Bringing me home? Raising me alone instead of finding a wife? Having your own kids?" Thomas had turned to look at her fully, dish towel in hand, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Pain, love, and a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her chest tighten. "Sarah Webb," he'd said quietly, "you are my own kid. Don't ever doubt that." She didn't, but she wondered. The wondering grew sharper that winter when Thomas suffered a minor heart attack at the garage. Nothing life-threatening, the doctors assured her. But at 56, he wasn't young anymore, and stress was the enemy. Sarah started visiting more frequently, taking over some of the household tasks, making sure he took his medication and ate vegetables instead of living on coffee and cigarettes. It was during one of these visits, while Thomas was napping in his recliner and Sarah was organizing the hallway closet, that she decided to tackle the attic. The Webb house had accumulated 2 generations of careful hoarding. Boxes of Grandma Webb's china, Thomas's military memorabilia, old photo albums documenting a life Sarah had always accepted without questioning too deeply. She'd been putting off the attic for months, but with Thomas's health scare, the practical need to sort through everything had become urgent. The footlocker sat in the far corner, military-issue olive drab, with T. Webb stenciled on the lid. Sarah had seen it her whole life, assumed it contained the usual veterans collection. Medals, uniform pieces, letters from army buddies. Thomas had never been secretive about his service. He'd shown her his discharge papers, told her sanitized stories about occupation duty in Austria, even kept his unit photo on the living room mantel. But the footlocker had always been locked. The key was in the attic, too, hanging on a nail behind an old mirror, as if Thomas had hidden it in plain sight, accessible but not obvious. Sarah hesitated with her hand on the key, some instinct warning her that locked things stayed locked for reasons. But she was an adult now, a woman who paid her own rent and graded spelling tests and understood that parents were human beings with private corners. She turned the key. Inside, beneath a folded dress uniform and a stack of German-language newspapers from 1946, Sarah found a leather document folder secured with a brass clasp. Her hands shook as she opened it. The note was written in precise, old-fashioned German script. Sarah's language skills were good enough to translate slowly. "My child, protect her. She is innocent of my sins. I have taken my own life rather than face what I have done. My service pistol's beside me. Tell her I was a coward. Tell her the truth. Oberst K. Richter. Beneath the note lay a Luger pistol, its grip worn smooth by use, and a small black and white photograph of a Wehrmacht officer holding an infant. The baby in the photograph had Sarah's eyes. What would you do if you discovered your entire life had been built on a carefully constructed fiction? If the man you called father had kept the evidence of your origin locked away, neither fully hiding it nor fully revealing it? Sarah sat in the attic dust, the note trembling in her hands, and felt 23 years of identity dissolve like sugar in hot water. The world didn't end all at once. It cracked slowly, like ice under pressure. Sarah sat frozen in the attic for nearly an hour, her mind trying to reconcile the impossible arithmetic of the documents in her lap with the life she'd always known. The sound of Thomas stirring downstairs finally broke her paralysis. She heard his footsteps, the creak of the recliner, his voice calling up, "Sarah? You still up there, honey?" The ordinariness of it, the paternal concern, the casual endearment, felt like a betrayal now, though she couldn't articulate exactly who had betrayed whom. "Just finishing up," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. She carefully returned everything to the footlocker except the note and the photograph. Those she folded into her coat pocket, her heartbeat so loud she was certain Thomas would hear it from downstairs. The Luger she left behind. Touching it felt too much like touching the edge of something unspeakable. That night, Sarah went home to her apartment and didn't sleep. She spread the evidence on her kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light and forced herself to translate the note word by word, checking her German dictionary when uncertainty crept in. There was no mistaking it. Oberst, Colonel, mein Kind, my child. Protect her. Protect her. By dawn, she'd made a decision that would define everything that came after. She would confront Thomas, but she would do it carefully, strategically, the way you might approach a wounded animal that could either attack or flee. Because Sarah Webb was many things: a teacher, a daughter, an orphan who'd never known she was orphaned. But she was also, apparently, the child of a Nazi officer. And the man who'd raised her had been standing close enough to that officer to claim his pistol and his final confession. The question that burned through her insomnia was simple and terrible. Had Thomas Webb found Klaus Richter already dead, or had he helped him die? 3 days later, Sarah returned to her father's house on a Wednesday evening. Thomas was in the garage as usual, rebuilding a carburetor with the patient precision she'd always admired. The radio played Creedence Clearwater Revival, and for a moment Sarah wanted to retreat, to unknow what she knew, to preserve the comfortable fiction of their life together. But the note in her pocket weighed more than paper should. "Daddy," she said from the doorway, and something in her voice made Thomas set down his wrench immediately. He turned, wiping his hands on an oil rag, and Sarah saw the exact moment he understood. His face didn't change dramatically. Thomas Webb had learned to control his expressions during the war, but his eyes flickered to her coat pocket, then back to her face, and she watched him calculate how much she'd found and what it meant. "The attic," he said quietly. Not a question. "The footlocker." Sarah pulled out the photograph first, held it up so the garage's overhead bulb illuminated the image of Klaus Richter holding an infant. "This is me. This is my father. My real father." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm your real father, Sarah. I'm the one who raised you. You're the man who lied to me." The anger surprised her with its intensity. For 23 years. About everything. Not everything. Thomas moved toward her slowly, hands visible like he was approaching something fragile. I lied about where you came from, but I never lied about loving you, about wanting you, about... He was a Nazi. Sarah's voice cracked on the word. A colonel. The note says he was a colonel, which means he wasn't just following orders, he was giving them. And you... She pulled out the note, unfolded it with shaking hands. You found him. You were there when he died. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of a car passing on Walnut Street and the tick of cooling metal from the engine Thomas had been working on. Yes, Thomas finally said. I was there. Did you kill him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Webb had faced many hard things in his 56 years: combat, loss, the loneliness of raising a child alone. But Sarah saw that this question was perhaps the hardest. His face aged a decade in the time it took him to answer. No, he said quietly. Klaus Richter killed himself. I found him already dead, with you crying in a crate beside him. That's the truth, Sarah. That's what happened. But you took his gun. You kept his note. Sarah's voice broke. You've been carrying this secret my whole life. Why? Why not just tell me? Why not let me grow up knowing? Thomas sank onto his workbench stool, suddenly looking every one of his years. Because I wanted you to have a chance, he said. A real chance. Not as Klaus Richter's daughter, but as Sarah Webb, as an American girl who could go to school and make friends and dream about the future without... He stopped, swallowed hard. Without carrying the weight of what your father did. What did he do? Sarah heard herself ask. The note says sins. What sins? Thomas's hands clenched on his knees. Richter commanded the garrison at Mauthausen concentration camp. Do you know what that means? Sarah did. She'd studied World War II in college, seen the photographs that newspapers had been brave enough to print, read the testimonies from Nuremberg. Mauthausen, the stone quarry, the stairs of death. Thousands murdered through forced labor, execution, medical experimentation. She sat down hard on a stack of tires, the strength leaving her legs. My father, she whispered. My biological father was responsible for that. Your biological father was a monster who, at the very end, tried to do one decent thing. Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. He could have left you to die in that bunker. He could have taken you with him into whatever hell he was running toward. Instead, he wrote that note. He made sure you'd be found. And Sarah... Thomas leaned forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He asked whoever found you to tell you the truth, to tell you he was a coward. He wanted you to know. The recognition twist settled over Sarah like a shroud. All those years of watching Thomas grow quiet when she practiced German. All those times he'd discouraged her interest in European history. All those moments when she'd caught him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It had been this. He'd been watching her grow up into someone completely unlike Klaus Richter, watching her become kind and curious and good, and carrying the knowledge that one day she might discover the truth and hate him for hiding it. Why keep the note? Sarah asked, her voice small. Why keep the gun? If you wanted me to never know, why not destroy the evidence? Thomas smiled sadly. Because Richter asked me to tell you the truth, and I hoped, that maybe one day, when you were old enough, when you were strong enough, I could show you where you came from and who you'd become despite it. I kept the evidence because it was yours, Sarah. Your history, I had no right to destroy it, even if I also couldn't bear to give it to you when you were too young to understand. They sat in the garage for a long time, father and daughter, or whatever they were now, while the November darkness pressed against the windows. Sarah thought about the children she taught, their innocent faces looking up at her during story time. She thought about the war orphans still scattered across Europe, growing up with fragments of identity and half-remembered trauma. She thought about Thomas Webb, who'd made a choice in an Austrian bunker 23 years ago to save a monster's daughter and raise her as his own. "I need time," she finally said. "I need to think about this, about who I am, about everything." Thomas nodded, not arguing, not pleading. "Take all the time you need." "But Sarah," he waited until she looked at him. "You're not defined by Klaus Richter's blood. You're defined by your choices, by who you choose to be, and you've chosen to be someone good." Sarah left without answering, the note and photograph burning in her pocket like hot coals. But as she drove home through the cold Pennsylvania night, one question consumed her above all others. If Thomas had found Richter already dead, why had he kept the Luger? Why not report it, turn it in with the other captured weapons? What else was her father, both of her fathers, not telling her? Sarah stopped sleeping through the night. Instead, she researched, methodically, obsessively, the way she'd once prepared lesson plans or studied for exams, except now the subject was her own impossible origin. The Harrisburg Public Library's reference section became her evening refuge. She requested microfilm reels of 1945 and 1946 European newspapers, military records that had been declassified in the 60s, and translated testimonies from the Nuremberg trials. The librarian, Mrs. Kowalski, asked no questions but watched Sarah with grandmotherly concern as the young woman hunched over the reader week after week, taking notes in a spiral notebook that grew fat with dates and names and the careful mapping of atrocity. Klaus Richter's name appeared in 12 separate documents. His service record showed a steady rise through Wehrmacht ranks. Not SS, Sarah noted with a strange relief she immediately felt guilty for, from lieutenant in 1939 to colonel by 1943. The assignment to Mauthausen came in January 1944. He'd served there for 15 months before the camp's liberation in May 1945, then disappeared into the chaos of Austria's final days. But it was the testimony that haunted Sarah. A survivor named Jakob Stein, testifying in Nuremberg in 1946, described Colonel Richter as efficient but not sadistic. He did not take pleasure in cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He administered death the way another man might administer a factory, with schedules, with quotas, with absolute indifference to the humanity of his victims. Sarah read that passage 3 times before she had to excuse herself to the library bathroom and vomit. This was the man whose blood ran through her veins. Not a raving monster, but something perhaps more chilling. A bureaucrat of murder. A man who'd killed thousands without passion, simply because it was his assigned duty. And yet, the note kept pulling her back. She is innocent of my sins. Tell her I was a coward. Tell her the truth. What had changed in Klaus Richter between administering death camps and writing a confession? Had he always carried some seed of conscience that finally sprouted in his final hours? Or had it been Sarah herself, the fact of her existence, helpless and dependent, that cracked through his carefully maintained indifference? Sarah would never know, but the not knowing was its own kind of torment. She avoided Thomas's calls for 2 weeks. His messages, left with her landlady or scrawled on notes tucked under her apartment door, were patient but persistent. Just want to make sure you're okay. Call when you're ready. Love, Dad. The word dad stopped her every time. By mid-December 1969, with snow beginning to accumulate on Harrisburg streets and Christmas decorations appearing in shop windows, Sarah made a decision. She would find out everything, not just what the historical record showed, but what Thomas himself knew and wasn't saying. Because the pieces didn't quite fit. Good men didn't keep Nazi pistols as souvenirs. Honest men didn't lock away evidence for 23 years unless they were hiding something deeper than a wartime adoption. She called Thomas on a Friday evening. "I'm coming over Sunday," she said without preamble, "and I want the whole truth, everything that happened in that bunker, everything you've kept from me." There was a long pause before Thomas answered. "All right," he said quietly. "Sunday. I'll make coffee." When Sarah arrived Sunday afternoon, the house smelled like the cinnamon rolls Grandma Webb used to make. Thomas's attempt at comfort food, maybe, or an offering of normalcy. Sarah hung her coat, accepted the coffee, and sat across from her father at the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals. "Before you start," Thomas said, his hands wrapped around his mug, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you, I've never told anyone. Not the Army investigators, not the chaplain who helped with your adoption papers, not even my mother. I've carried it alone for 23 years and—" His voice caught. "And I'm glad you're finally asking, because keeping secrets from you has been the hardest thing I've ever done." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. "Just tell me." Thomas took a breath. "Klaus Richter didn't commit suicide." The words hung between them like ice crystals, sharp and cold. "But the note," Sarah began. "It says, the note is real. Richter wrote it, but he didn't pull the trigger." Thomas's eyes met hers, and Sarah saw something she'd never seen in her father before. Raw, undefended guilt. "I did." The kitchen seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the table edge, trying to process what she'd just heard. "You killed him. I executed him." Thomas's voice was steady now, as if some dam had finally broken and the truth was pouring out in a flood he could no longer contain. "When I found that bunker, Richter was alive. Wounded. He'd taken shrapnel from artillery fire the day before. Probably wouldn't have lasted another 24 hours without medical attention. But conscious. He was holding you, trying to keep you warm. And when he saw me, he didn't beg for mercy or try to run. He told me his name, his rank, what he'd done at Mauthausen." "Why?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Why would he confess?" "Because he wanted me to kill him." Thomas's hands trembled on the coffee mug. "He said he couldn't do it himself while holding you, couldn't risk the bullet going through him and hitting you by accident. He asked me, begged me, to take you somewhere safe and then come back and finish what he didn't have the courage to finish alone." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she hadn't realized she was crying. "So you did." "Not at first. I took you back to camp, got you cleaned up, started the paperwork for temporary custody. I told myself I'd report Richter's location, let the official war crimes investigators handle it. That was procedure. That was right." Thomas's voice grew hollow. "But then I talked to one of the intelligence officers, asked what would happen to Richter if we captured him. And he told me there were deals being made. Scientists, engineers, anyone with valuable knowledge was being offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. And Richter had been in charge of a forced labor camp. He knew logistics, management, how to extract maximum productivity from minimum resources. The implication was so obscene that Sarah couldn't speak. They were going to give him a deal, Thomas continued. Maybe not freedom, but protection. A quiet trial, a light sentence, then recruitment into some Allied reconstruction program. And all those people he'd murdered, thousands of them, Sarah, they'd get nothing. No justice, no accounting. Just the knowledge that their killer was valuable enough to save. So you went back, Sarah said. I went back. Thomas's voice was barely audible. I took his Luger. He'd set it aside when he wrote the note. And I asked him one more time if he understood what he'd done. If he accepted that he deserved to die for it. And he looked me right in the eyes and said yes. Said he'd tried to be what the Reich told him to be. Tried to believe the orders made it acceptable, but holding you, his daughter, had broken something inside him, made him see what he'd really been, what he'd really done. Thomas's hands were shaking so badly now that coffee slopped over the rim of his mug. He asked me to tell you he was sorry, that he hoped you'd grow up in a world where people like him couldn't exist. And then he closed his eyes and waited. The silence that followed felt like the silence inside a grave. I put the barrel against his temple, Thomas whispered, and I pulled the trigger. And then I positioned his hand on the gun and wrote in my report that I'd found him already deceased from self-inflicted wounds. I kept the Luger and the note because they were the only evidence of what had really happened. The only proof that at least one Nazi got the justice he deserved instead of a backroom deal. Sarah sat paralyzed, trying to reconcile this confession with everything she'd ever known about Thomas Webb, the gentle mechanic who'd taught her to ride a bicycle, who'd sat through endless school recitals, who'd never raised his voice or his hand in anger. You murdered him, she finally said. Yes. To protect me? No. Thomas met her eyes. I killed him because it was right, because some crimes are too great for courtrooms and deals and political convenience, and because he asked me to. His voice broke. I've questioned that choice every day for 23 years, Sarah. Wondered if I was just as much a murderer as he was. Wondered if I damned myself by playing executioner. But I've never regretted making sure Klaus Richter didn't walk away from what he did. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent, covering the Pennsylvania streets in forgiveness the human world couldn't offer. Sarah thought about her students, about teaching them right from wrong in a world where the line between them was never as clear as children's books suggested. She thought about Jakob Stein's testimony, about the thousands who died in Mauthausen's stone quarry, about the justice they'd never received. And she thought about the man sitting across from her, who'd carried the weight of execution and adoption and secret-keeping for more than 2 decades, who'd loved her completely while knowing exactly whose daughter she was. I need to understand something, Sarah said slowly. You killed a war criminal. You saved his daughter. You raised her as your own, knowing what her father had done. Why? Why take on that burden? Thomas's smile was sad and infinitely weary. Because you were innocent, Sarah. Because children don't choose their parents or their blood. And because I hoped, that raising you to be good, to be kind, to be everything Klaus Richter wasn't, would be a better form of justice than anything a courtroom could deliver. Were you right? The question burned in Sarah's mind, but she couldn't ask it yet. Because she didn't know the answer. Didn't know if her existence redeemed anything or simply complicated the moral arithmetic of guilt and inheritance. What she did know was that Thomas Webb had given her a choice Klaus Richter never had. The choice to decide who she would become despite where she'd come from. But that choice came with a price neither of them had fully calculated yet. Sarah didn't speak to Thomas for 6 weeks after his confession. The silence wasn't anger exactly. Anger would have been simpler, cleaner, but something closer to vertigo. The disorientation of discovering that gravity worked differently than she'd always believed. She kept teaching, kept grading papers and organizing holiday parties for her second graders, kept smiling at parents during conferences and singing carols at the school assembly. But inside, she felt hollow, as if the foundation of her identity had been excavated and nothing solid had yet filled the space. January 1970 arrived with brutal cold that froze the Susquehanna River solid for the first time in a decade. Sarah spent her evenings in her apartment, wrapped in blankets, reading and rereading Klaus Richter's note until she'd memorized every loop and flourish of his handwriting. She'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a woman in her 50s who'd worked extensively with war veterans and their families, and the sessions were slowly giving shape to questions Sarah hadn't known how to articulate. "You're grieving multiple losses simultaneously," Dr. Marsh explained during their fourth session. "The father you thought you had, the father you actually had, and the person you believed yourself to be. That's not a process that resolves quickly. How do I know who I am if everything I thought was true was a lie?" Sarah asked. "Everything?" Dr. Marsh raised an eyebrow. "Thomas Webb loved you. That was true. He sacrificed his own peace of mind to give you a stable childhood. That was true. You grew up to be a compassionate, intelligent woman who cares deeply about children and justice. That's true too. The facts of your origin don't erase the facts of your life, but they complicated them unbearably." By February, Sarah had made another decision. She needed to see Mauthausen for herself, needed to stand where Klaus Richter had stood, to understand the physical reality of what he'd done and what Thomas had judged worth killing for. She had spring break in April and enough savings for a plane ticket to Vienna if she didn't eat much for the next 2 months. She told no one about the plan except Dr. Marsh, who listened carefully and then said, "Going there won't give you the answers you're looking for, but it might give you the right questions." The night before Sarah bought her ticket, Thomas called. She'd been avoiding his calls, letting them ring through to her landlady's phone and then throwing away the messages unread. But this time something made her answer. Maybe exhaustion, maybe curiosity, maybe the simple human need for connection she'd been denying herself. "Sarah." Thomas's voice was rough, like he'd been crying or hadn't slept. "I know you don't want to talk to me. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you with everything else." Sarah closed her eyes. "What now?" "Your mother." The 2 words hung in the air like a held breath. Klaus Richter's wife. Her name was Anna Bergman before she married him. And Sarah, she was Jewish. The apartment seemed to tilt again, that same vertiginous feeling of having the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible," Sarah heard herself say. "Nazis didn't marry Jews. It was illegal. They married in 1938, before the racial laws fully tightened, before Kristallnacht, before," Thomas paused. Anna's family had converted to Catholicism 2 generations back. She had the papers to prove Aryan ancestry, even though everyone in their Vienna neighborhood knew the truth. Richter was a junior officer then, ambitious, but not yet committed to the ideology. People thought he married her because her family had money and connections. But he must have known. Sarah's voice was rising. He must have known what was coming, what the Reich was doing to Jews, and he sent her away. Thomas's voice was steady, delivering facts like a soldier delivering a report. "In 1942, when Anna was 5 months pregnant with you, Richter arranged for her to go to Switzerland. False papers, a fake identity, a bank account with enough money to survive. He told everyone she died of tuberculosis, but really he saved her. The one thing he saved. Sarah sat down hard on her threadbare couch. How do you know this? Because I found her. The confession hit like a physical blow. After I brought you home, Thomas continued, I couldn't let it go. Couldn't stop wondering if there was family out there, someone who deserved to know you'd survived. So I used my intelligence contacts, called in favors, traced Anna Bergman through Swiss refugee records. I found her in Zurich in 1949. She was working as a seamstress, living under the name Maria Keller. And I wrote to her, told her I'd found her daughter. And? Sarah could barely breathe. She wrote back, said that Klaus Richter had destroyed any claim she had to motherhood when he chose to serve the Reich instead of leaving with her. Said she'd spent 3 years in Switzerland, listening to reports of what was being done to her people, knowing her husband was part of the machinery of genocide. She couldn't. Thomas's voice cracked. She couldn't bear to look at you and see his face. So she asked me to raise you, to give you a life she couldn't, and to never tell you about her until you were old enough to understand that love isn't always simple or strong enough to overcome what history does to people. Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Is she still alive? I don't know. We exchanged a few letters over the years. I sent her school photos of you, updates on your life. She sent money sometimes, anonymously, through a Swiss bank. The letters stopped in 1965. I tried to find out what happened, but Maria Keller had disappeared. Either she died, or she decided to cut ties completely. So Sarah had lost 2 mothers, one who'd given birth to her and couldn't love her, and Grandma Webb, who died when Sarah was 15. The arithmetic of maternal loss was becoming unbearable. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah asked. Because you have a right to know all of it, Thomas said simply. And because I've been thinking about guilt, about inheritance, about what we owe to the dead and to the living. Klaus Richter was a monster, but he also loved his wife enough to save her life, and his daughter enough to ensure she'd be found. Anna Bergman was a victim, but she also couldn't overcome her trauma enough to be your mother. And his voice broke completely. I killed a man and raised his daughter, and I still don't know if any of it was right or if I'm just as broken as all of them. Sarah heard the truth beneath his words. Thomas wasn't confessing for absolution. He was confessing because he was drowning in the same questions she had been drowning for 23 years, and he couldn't carry the weight alone anymore. I'm going to Mauthausen, Sarah said quietly. In April. I need to see it. I'll come with you. No. The refusal was immediate and certain. This is something I need to do alone. Thomas didn't argue. When you come back, he said, if you come back ready to talk, I'll be here, always. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment and tried to imagine Anna Bergman, a Jewish woman who'd survived the Holocaust by accident of paperwork and a Nazi husband's guilty conscience, who'd carried a child for 9 months and then spent the rest of her life unable to claim her. How did you reconcile that kind of fragmented love? How did you inherit that kind of fractured history? Dr. Marsh had said the trip wouldn't give her answers, but as Sarah stared at the photograph of Klaus Richter holding an infant, herself, she realized she wasn't looking for answers anymore. She was looking for a way to live with questions that had no resolution. And maybe that was enough. The snow kept falling outside, covering Harrisburg in white silence, and Sarah Webb, daughter of a Nazi, daughter of a Holocaust survivor, daughter of an American executioner, began to understand that identity wasn't something you inherited or discovered. It was something you built, piece by careful piece, from the ruins of what came before. The stone stairs of Mauthausen concentration camp climbed 186 steps from the quarry floor to the camp above. Prisoners had called them the stairs of death, forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 100 pounds up the uneven steps, beaten if they stumbled, shot if they stopped, worked until their bodies simply gave out and they fell backward, taking other prisoners down with them in a cascade of bodies and stone. Sarah stood at the bottom in the April rain, trying to breathe. She'd arrived in Austria 3 days earlier, spent 2 nights in a small Salzburg hotel preparing herself for this moment. But no amount of reading, no documentary footage, no historical testimony could have prepared her for the physical reality of this place. The quarry walls rose around her like the walls of a cathedral built to worship cruelty. Gray granite scarred with drill marks, every surface speaking of forced labor and industrialized death. A tour group passed her, speaking in hushed German, their guide explaining the camp's history with the careful neutrality required of memorial sites. Sarah let them move on. She'd come alone, deliberately, needing to confront this place without the buffer of other people's reactions. This was where Klaus Richter had worked. These stairs, this quarry, these barracks visible at the top of the hill, he'd walked among them daily from January 1944 to May 1945. Had he watched prisoners die on these steps? Had he given the orders? Or had he simply filed reports and approved quotas, keeping his hands technically clean while the machinery of murder ground on around him? Jakob Stein's testimony echoed in Sarah's mind. He administered death the way another man might administer a factory. Sarah began to climb. Her legs were strong. She was young and healthy and well-fed. But by the 50th step, her thighs were burning. By the 100th, she was breathing hard. By the 150th, she understood viscerally what this climb meant when you were starving, beaten, carrying granite that weighed nearly as much as you did. She reached the top, gasping, and sat down on the damp grass, overlooking the quarry where thousands had died. The recognition that settled over her was almost gentle in its finality. Klaus Richter had been responsible for this, not in the abstract way of historical guilt, but in the concrete reality of signatures on death lists, approval of work quotas, the daily small decisions that accumulated into mass murder. And Thomas Webb had executed him for it, not in hot rage or battlefield chaos, but deliberately, after Richter had confessed and asked for exactly that justice. Sarah pulled out the photograph she'd carried across the Atlantic. Klaus Richter holding an infant. Looking at it now, here, she saw something she'd missed before. Richter's eyes in the photograph weren't looking at the camera. They were looking down at the baby with an expression that could only be called grief, as if he already understood what he'd done and who he'd become, and couldn't bear to imagine his daughter knowing it. "Did you think it would erase anything?" Sarah whispered to the photograph. "Saving Anna? Saving me? Did you think it balanced the ledger?" The rain intensified, cold and cleansing, and Sarah let it soak through her jacket. A man approached, elderly, perhaps 70, with a cane and the careful movements of someone whose body had been broken and badly healed. He wore a coat despite the April warmth, and Sarah noticed the number tattooed on his forearm before he spoke. "You are American," he said in accented English, "but you cry like someone with personal ghosts." Sarah wiped her face, unsure if the moisture was rain or tears. "My father was—" She stopped, reformulated. The man who gave me life was a commander here, Colonel Klaus Richter. The old man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Richter, he repeated slowly. The efficient one. Not the worst of them, people said, which made him no better. The worst enjoyed the cruelty. Richter simply accepted it as necessary. I sometimes think the second category was more dangerous. Did you? Sarah couldn't finish the question. I was here from 1943 until liberation, the man said. I carried stones up those stairs. I watched friends die on them. I survived because I was young and lucky and because the Americans arrived before my luck ran out. He studied Sarah's face carefully. You did not choose your father, but you chose to come here. That matters. Does it? Sarah's voice broke. Does it matter that I feel guilty for existing? That half my blood comes from a monster, and the other half from a woman who couldn't bear to look at me because of it? The old man was quiet for a long moment, leaning on his cane, looking out over the quarry where so much death had occurred. I will tell you what matters, he finally said. After liberation, I learned that my entire family had been killed. My parents, my 3 sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, 42 people erased as if they had never existed. And I was so angry, so full of hatred, that I thought I would spend my life hunting down the men who'd done it and killing them one by one. Why didn't you? Because I met a woman, a German woman whose husband had died fighting the Nazis in the underground resistance. She was as much a victim as I was, and when I realized that, I understood something important. Guilt is not hereditary, but neither is innocence. We are all born into histories we didn't create, and we have to decide what we will do with that inheritance. He turned to face Sarah fully. You did not kill anyone, Fräulein. You did not operate this camp or sign death warrants or force prisoners up those stairs. Your father did those things. You are only responsible for what you choose to do with the knowledge of what he was. And what should I do with it? The old man smiled sadly. That is the question only you can answer. But you are here. You came to see. You did not hide or pretend or protect yourself from this truth. That is already something. He touched her shoulder gently, then walked away, his cane tapping against the stone path that led back toward the visitor center. Sarah sat alone in the rain for another hour, watching the light change over the quarry. She thought about Thomas Webb, who'd executed a man rather than let him escape into protected obscurity. She thought about Anna Bergman, who'd loved Klaus Richter enough to marry him, and had hated what he became enough to disappear rather than claim their daughter. She thought about the 42 family members the old man had lost, and the thousands more who died here, and the impossible mathematics of guilt and redemption. No cosmic scale could balance these accounts. No amount of Sarah's goodness could erase Klaus Richter's evil. No amount of Thomas's love could justify his execution. And yet they had all tried, in their broken ways, to create meaning from horror. Anna had survived. Thomas had raised a daughter to be kind. Klaus Richter had, at the absolute end, asked to be told the truth about himself. And Sarah was here bearing witness, refusing to look away. As she descended the stairs of death, her legs shaking with exhaustion and emotion, Sarah made a decision that felt like the first fully autonomous choice of her life. She would not hide from what Klaus Richter had done, but she would not be defined by it either. She would teach her students about the Holocaust, about moral courage, about the importance of remembering. She would tell them, when they were old enough, that evil wasn't always obvious, that monsters could love their children, and that the hardest truths were the ones that couldn't be simplified into good versus evil. She would tell them that she was Klaus Richter's daughter and that she had chosen to be Sarah Webb anyway. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah turned back one last time. The quarry loomed above her, a permanent scar on the earth, a place where cruelty had been systematized and suffering had been measured in granite blocks and broken bodies. "I'm sorry," she said to the thousands of ghosts who died there. "I'm sorry for what he did. I'm sorry I exist because of him. But I'm going to try. I'm going to spend my life trying, to be proof that something can grow from ashes." The rain stopped. The sun broke through clouds, and Sarah Webb, daughter of Klaus Richter, daughter of Anna Bergman, daughter of Thomas Webb, walked away from Mauthausen carrying all her histories with her, heavy but no longer crushing. Justice had been served in that Austrian bunker 24 years ago. Now it was time to figure out what mercy looked like. Sarah returned to Pennsylvania in late April with European mud still on her shoes and a clarity that felt like emerging from underwater. Thomas was waiting at the Harrisburg airport, standing apart from the crowd of families and businessmen, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He'd aged in the months since their last real conversation. New lines around his eyes, more gray in his hair, and Sarah understood with sudden force that he'd been carrying his own exile, his own quarantine of guilt, waiting to see if she would ever forgive him. She walked straight to him and wrapped her arms around his chest. Thomas went rigid with surprise, then collapsed into the embrace, his whole body shaking with silent sobs. They stood like that in the fluorescent glow of baggage claim while travelers flowed around them, two people who'd been separated by truth and were now trying to find their way back to each other. "I saw it," Sarah said quietly against his shoulder. "Mauthausen, the quarry, the stairs." "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry you had to carry that." "I'm not." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "I needed to see it, to understand what you were protecting me from, what you were trying to balance when you did what you did." They drove home in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've survived something together. Spring had arrived in Pennsylvania during Sarah's absence, dogwoods blooming pink and white along the highways, the Susquehanna running high with snowmelt. Everything looked simultaneously exactly the same and completely transformed, the way the world does when you've changed, and it hasn't. Over the next weeks, Sarah and Thomas rebuilt their relationship carefully, like archaeologists piecing together fragments of pottery, handling each piece with care, accepting that some cracks would never fully disappear. They had dinner every Sunday. They talked about safe things at first: Thomas's work at the garage, Sarah's students, the Phillies' terrible season, before gradually, tentatively, beginning to discuss the harder subjects. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked one evening in May as they sat on Thomas's porch watching fireflies emerge. "Killing him? Taking me? All of it?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly in the old swing. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally said. "I regret living in a world where a man like Klaus Richter could exist, where the systems meant to deliver justice were so compromised that execution felt like the only moral choice. But do I regret that Richter died and you lived and we found each other?" He shook his head. "No. I'd make the same choice tomorrow. Even knowing what it cost you, what it cost me." "You're a good person, Sarah. A kind person. You teach children, and you fight for what's right, and you didn't let learning the worst possible truth about your origins destroy you." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "Whatever it Cost, seeing who you became, that was worth it. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I met a survivor there, at Mauthausen. He told me guilt isn't hereditary. Smart man. But neither is innocence. Sarah turned to face her father fully. I've been thinking about that. About what I owe. To the people Richter killed. To the history I inherited. To the life you gave me, and I think... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think I need to tell the truth. Not hide from it. Not let it define me, but not pretend it doesn't exist either. Thomas's expression grew wary. What kind of truth-telling are you thinking about? I want to teach Holocaust education. Really teach it. Not just the sanitized version, but the complicated reality of how ordinary people became complicit, how bureaucracy enabled genocide, how victims and perpetrators were sometimes more tangled up than we want to admit. Sarah took a deep breath. And I want to tell my students, when it's appropriate, that my biological father was one of those perpetrators, that I know personally what it means to inherit a legacy of atrocity. Sarah, Thomas began, but she held up a hand. I've thought about this carefully. I've talked to Dr. Marsh about it, and I have to believe, that my existence can mean something beyond just surviving Richter's crimes. That I can use this awful inheritance to help people understand how evil happens and why it matters to resist it. Her voice grew stronger. You killed Richter because you believed in justice. Let me honor that by making sure people remember what he did and why it mattered. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah saw pride and pain warring in his expression. You're braver than I ever was, he said quietly. I learned from you. You learned despite me. Thomas smiled sadly. But yes, if this is what you need to do, to make meaning from all this, then I support you. His voice cracked. Just promise me you'll be careful, that you won't let other people's judgment destroy what you've built. I promise. They sat in the gathering darkness, listening to crickets and the distant sound of traffic on Walnut Street. Two people bound by choices neither had fully chosen, but both had learned to carry. That summer, Sarah began developing her new curriculum. She started cautiously, additional units on perpetrator psychology for her graduate education courses at the local community college, where she'd begun teaching part-time. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Students hungry for complexity, for truth that acknowledged the messy reality of history, rather than flattening it into simple moral lessons. By fall, Sarah had gained enough confidence to share her personal connection during a lecture on generational trauma. My biological father, she told a classroom of 20 future teachers, was a Nazi officer who commanded a concentration camp garrison. He murdered thousands of people through forced labor, execution, and bureaucratic indifference, and I am his daughter. The room went absolutely silent. I tell you this, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, not to shock you or to center myself in a story that isn't about me, but to demonstrate that the consequences of genocide don't end when the camps are liberated. They echo through generations. They complicate families. They force people like me to decide what we owe to history and to the future. A young woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. How do you live with that knowledge? Sarah smiled sadly. By remembering that I didn't choose my father, but I can choose who I become. By teaching, by bearing witness, by refusing to let his crimes define me while also refusing to hide from them, and by believing that even the worst inheritance can be transformed into something that serves life instead of death. After class, students lined up to talk to her, not with judgment, but with questions, with their own complicated family histories, with a hunger for permission to acknowledge that identity was messy and history was painful, and that we could still build meaning from ruins. One student, David Chen, whose grandparents had survived Japanese internment camps, stayed until everyone else had left. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being honest, for showing us that you can carry difficult truth and still do good work." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of shame she'd been carrying since that January evening when she'd opened Thomas's footlocker. "We're all carrying difficult truths," she replied. "The question is what we do with them." By December, Sarah's reputation as an educator willing to tackle the hardest aspects of Holocaust history had spread beyond Pennsylvania. She received an invitation to speak at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., scheduled for the following spring. A lecture on the children of perpetrators, inherited guilt, and moral responsibility. When she told Thomas, he was quiet for a long time before speaking. "Your mother would be proud," he finally said. "Which one?" Sarah asked, not cruelly, just acknowledging the complicated arithmetic of her maternity. "All of them," Thomas replied. "Anna, for surviving and giving you life even knowing what that would cost. My mother, for loving you without question. And," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "and maybe even Klaus Richter's wife, the woman he married before he became a monster. The woman who loved a man who then chose ideology over humanity. Maybe she would have been proud to know that their daughter became someone who fights against everything he stood for." Sarah thought about that. About Anna Bergman, who'd spent decades as Maria Keller in Switzerland, who'd sent anonymous money and school photos but couldn't overcome her trauma enough to be a mother. Had she followed Sarah's life from afar? Did she know what her daughter had become? "I'm going to try to find her," Sarah said. "When I go to D.C., I'm going to stop in Switzerland first. See if I can track down what happened to Anna. I need to know, I need to try, at least, to tell her that I understand why she couldn't be my mother, and that I'm grateful she gave me life anyway." Thomas nodded slowly. "Do you want me to come with you?" Sarah considered, then shook her head. "No. This is something I need to do alone. But when I come back..." She took his hand. "When I come back, I want us to go together to the Army Records Department. I want to document what really happened in that bunker. Not for prosecution. There's no one left to prosecute. But for history. So that someday, when scholars study this period, they'll understand that justice took many forms. Some official, some not. All complicated. They'll judge me," Thomas said quietly. "Call me a vigilante, a murderer. They might," Sarah agreed. "But they'll also see that you raised the daughter of a Nazi war criminal to be someone who dedicates her life to remembering his victims. If that's not justice, I don't know what is." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Harrisburg in the same forgiving white that had fallen the night Sarah discovered the truth. But this time, the snow felt less like burial and more like renewal, a blank page waiting for whatever came next. Sarah Webb had inherited impossible things: a perpetrator's blood, a survivor's abandonment, an executioner's love. And from those fragments, she was building something new. The Swiss records office in Zurich smelled of old paper and lemon polish, and Sarah's hands trembled as she filled out the request forms. Maria Keller, born Anna Bergman, had died in March 1968, 2 years before Sarah discovered the truth about her origins. The clerk handed Sarah a thin file, a death certificate, an address for a small apartment in the Niederdorf district, and one additional document that made Sarah's breath catch. A sealed letter marked, to be opened only by Sarah Webb or her legal guardian, should she ever inquire. Anna had known Sarah might come looking. Sarah found a quiet corner and opened the envelope with shaking fingers. The letter inside was written in English, dated February 1968, just weeks before Anna's death. My daughter, if you are reading this, then you have learned the truth. I have imagined this moment for 30 years. I was 19 when I met Klaus Richter. We married in December 1938, and I believed we would have a simple, happy life. But the man who sent me to Switzerland in 1942 was already someone else. Someone who could save one Jewish woman, his wife, while participating in the murder of thousands. When I arrived in Switzerland and began to hear the reports, began to understand what Mauthausen meant, I could not reconcile the man I had loved with the monster he became. I tried to be your mother. When Thomas Webb wrote to tell me you had survived, I sent money. I looked at your photographs. But every time I tried to travel to America, I would see Klaus's face in yours and remember what he had done. This is my greatest failure. I could not separate you from him in my heart. And for that, for my cowardice, for my inability to overcome my trauma, I am more sorry than words can express. You are not responsible for what your father did. You are innocent of his sins, just as he wrote in his final note. I hope you can forgive me someday. Not for Klaus, his sins are his own, but for mine, for being too broken to be your mother. With love and regret, Anna Bergman Sarah read the letter 3 times before the tears came. Not angry tears, but tears of recognition and release. Anna had been exactly as broken as Sarah had imagined, and exactly as human. That evening, Sarah walked to Anna's former address. An elderly woman with a small terrier studied Sarah's face and said, "You have Maria's eyes." She kept a photograph on her table, a little girl with dark hair. She would look at it every morning with her coffee. That night, Sarah wrote to Thomas, "Dad, I found Anna. She died 2 years ago, but she left me a letter explaining everything. She loved me. She failed me. She was human and broken, just like Klaus was human and monstrous, just like you were human and desperate and couldn't let injustice stand. When I come home, let's tell the truth together. All of it. Because we deserve to stop carrying this alone." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum before 200 people. "My name is Sarah Webb," she began. "I was born in April 1946 in a bunker outside Salzburg, Austria. My biological father was Oberst Klaus Richter, commanding officer of the Mauthausen concentration camp garrison. He was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, and I am his daughter." The silence was absolute. For the next hour, Sarah spoke about the complexity of guilt, the weight of inheritance, the importance of bearing witness. She shared Anna's letter and talked about Thomas's choice and explained that history was messier than we wanted it to be. "Klaus Richter was a monster who loved his wife," Sarah concluded. "Anna Bergman was a victim who couldn't love her daughter. Thomas Webb was a hero who committed murder. And I am all of their legacies, trying to build something that honors the dead while serving the living." Afterward, an elderly man approached. "I am Jakob Stein. I received your letter. I came to hear you speak." Sarah felt her throat close with emotion. "Your father's crimes do not define you," he said gently, "but your choice to face them honestly, that defines you. And it matters." 6 months later, Sarah and Thomas sat in a military records office dictating the truth about that Austrian bunker. The document was sealed for 50 years, but it existed, a permanent record that justice took many forms and that love had been complicated and costly and real. Sarah Webb became one of the nation's leading Holocaust educators, never hiding her parentage, never softening the truth. Thomas lived to see his daughter honored and celebrated, and sometimes, late at night, Sarah would read Anna's letter again, understanding that forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation wasn't. Evil was real. Justice was complicated. And love, messy, imperfect love, was still the thing that made survival worth it. To this day, people say you can still find Sarah Webb's curriculum materials in Holocaust education programs across America, teaching students that we inherit histories we didn't choose, and that our true measure is what we build from the ruins. If this story moved you, changed how you think about guilt and inheritance, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the complicated truths that make us human.